effort to achieve better physical health, we can exercise and eat nutritious food. Well, what can we do to achieve better mental health? This is the first program in a series of programs I'll be doing on mental health and what famous thinkers in psychology and philosophy, religion, and literature have said about it. Among the questions with which I'll be dealing are the following. Is being a well-adjusted person, well-adjusted to society, that is, a basis, even a requirement for good mental health? Can society make people sick? What are the characteristics of a mentally healthy person? Can a person be abnormal and in good mental health? Can a person be normal but in bad mental health? And is happiness a sign of mental health and unhappiness a sign of a lack of mental health? And finally, can happiness ever be a sign of a lack of mental health? Now to the first question. Again, is being well-adjusted, that is, well-adjusted to society, an important basis for mental health? Allow me to provide some historical perspective and you decide. We know that in Europe for several centuries, one could participate in or even approve of the burning of religious heretics and be considered to be well-adjusted to society. We also know that in most of the world, at one time or another, slavery existed, and we know that one could own slaves, or at the very least approve of slavery, and be considered to be well-adjusted to society. Indeed, Aristotle talked about the advantages of slavery. Aristotle was not an opponent of slavery, and we know that Washington, Jefferson, and Benjamin Franklin all owned slaves. We also know that in parts of Europe, at various times, one could discriminate against and even kill Jews and be considered to be well-adjusted to society. One final example. We know that in most of the world, throughout history, one could be in favor of denying basic human rights to women, and yet one could be considered to be a good, clear-thinking person. Indeed, Aristotle and Freud, among the famous thinkers, made disparaging comments at times about women. And we know that in the early 19th century United States, not only were women deprived of the right to vote, but women could not own property, could not attend college, and could not testify in court. Again, I'm talking about the United States in the early years of the 19th century. Remember the question I raised. Is being a well-adjusted person, that is, well-adjusted to society, an important basis for mental health? Well, what is mental health? Well, if you check the dictionary, mental, of or relating to the mind; health, soundness of body or mind, freedom from abnormality. So by mental health, what we mean is a sound mind. If we say that someone is in very good mental health, we mean that person has a very sound mind. It is interesting, therefore, that one could have killed people because of religious beliefs, enslaved people, treated women as possessions, and still have been considered to be in good mental health, to have a sound mind. Perhaps it was his knowledge of such things that prompted Nobel Prize-winning writer Hermann Hesse to say the following: "The world outside the lunatic asylums is as weird as life outside, the world outside the lunatic asylums is no less weird than the world inside." And the German philosopher Nietzsche said this: "Insanity in individuals is rare, but in groups and nations it is the rule." It is also interesting that other kinds of behavior have been acceptable and normal in some societies, while these same behaviors have been considered to be unacceptable and abnormal in others. Allow me to give you some examples. Incest. We know that in ancient Egypt, the king, the pharaoh, often married his own sister, occasionally married his own daughter. Infanticide, the killing of infants, was not uncommon in the Roman Republic, among other places. A deformed child or female child was sometimes left to die. We also know that many primitive tribes practiced sex hospitality, whereby the host would offer a traveler his wife or daughter's sexual services for the night. And we are told by historians that it was considered rude for a traveler to refuse such an offer. There have also been areas of the world where virginity was considered to be an impediment to marriage. That's right, virginity was considered to be an impediment to marriage. Marco Polo, in his writings about his travels through Asia, talked about such places. Marco Polo also talked about the idea of sex hospitality and his observations of it. We know that homosexuality was acceptable in some societies over the centuries and unacceptable in others. For example, in ancient Crete, Athens, and Sparta, no stigma at all was attached to homosexuality. Indeed, Sparta was a very military society, and one could be both macho and gay in Sparta. We know that Plato in the Symposium, one of the most famous books about love, has one of the characters in his work praise homosexual love. We also know that child marriage has existed in this world. Gandhi was married at age 13. His wife was also 13. And Gandhi, in his autobiography, reports that they had sex almost immediately after getting married. We also know that child labor was not uncommon in 19th century Europe, 18th century England, for example, where 9 and 10-year-olds worked 10-hour days. And of course, some societies have glorified suicide. We know about Japan and the kamikazes during World War II. And some would include the Middle East today, that it seems that in certain Middle Eastern cultures, that suicide bombers are even considered heroes in some communities. You're watching Life, Love, and Philosophy. The topic of this program is mental health. And at the present time, I'm dealing with the question, is being well-adjusted to society an important basis, even a requirement for mental health? And also in this program, I'll be dealing with, and in fact, am dealing with, the question, can society make people sick? This program, incidentally, can be seen on Tuesday evenings at 8:30 p.m. on Channel 35, and it's repeated on Sunday evenings at 10 p.m., also on Channel 35. It is interesting that over the centuries, people have been systematically persecuted because of religion, sex, and ethnicity, among other reasons. But apparently, no society has had a systematic persecution of dishonest people. Again, no society, as far as I know, has ever systematically persecuted dishonest people. People have been beaten up, even killed, for being Jewish, black, or gay. But have you ever heard of a society where dishonest businessmen and politicians were systematically beat up? Have you ever heard of a society where people who use devious means and even backstabbing to secure job promotions have been systematically beat up? Or a society in which students who cheat on tests are regularly beat up? Or a society in which racists are often beat up? By the way, I'm not advocating beating up anybody. Let me repeat that. I'm not advocating beating up anyone. But it does raise an interesting question, and that is a society sick when being honest is less important than ethnicity, sex, and sexual orientation. Let's talk about religion and mental health for just a minute. Why is it today that certain religious groups are very vocal, and maybe appropriately so, in condemning what they perceive to be sexual sins, but they are not equally vocal in condemning dishonesty in business, politics, and education? When was the last time you went to church, synagogue, mosque, and heard a sermon about office politics and people securing job promotions in less than ethical ways? Or a sermon about cheating in school. For example, people handing in term papers which they themselves have not written. Or politicians telling half-truths or even absolute lies in political campaigns. Is that not sinful behavior? Again, politicians telling half-truths or absolute lies in political campaigns. Is that not sinful behavior? And also, if you are a participant in organized religion, when was the last time you heard a sermon about people engaging in vicious gossip about other people, and the idea that some kinds of gossip can be sinful? And also, have you ever heard a sermon about radio and TV talk show hosts who regularly pander to the audience's hatred and other base instincts in human beings? Here is a question for those who participate in organized religion. What does your priest, minister, rabbi, imam talk about in his or her weekly sermons? A very important question is this, and I've been working up to this. Can society make people sick? Can society make people sick? I think it's fair to say that a society that encourages people to deny the human rights of certain groups of people is sick. Obvious examples, I think. Europe in the 16th and 17th centuries, when religious wars took place and people, Protestants condoned other Protestants killing Catholics, and Catholics condoned other Catholics killing Protestants. I think one could conclude that those societies were pretty sick, people condoning the killing of other people just because of their religious beliefs. Also, some would contend that the United States at one time was a very sick society, that in particular, the slaveholding part of the United States was a sick society. Did you know that when slavery was legal in the United States until 1865, that virtually every southern state had laws prohibiting the teaching of reading and writing to black children, to blacks in general, of course, but particularly to black children? I think some would conclude that any society that prohibits educating a group of children is a sick society. And of course, we know that in Nazi Germany, long before the Holocaust took place, it was legal to discriminate against Jewish people. A host of laws had been passed depriving Jewish people of basic human rights. So again, some would conclude Nazi Germany, I think most people, if not all reasonable people, would conclude Nazi Germany was a very sick society. These societies contributed to both perpetrators and victims becoming mentally sick, I submit to you. Perpetrators, yes, the perpetrators also. After all the major religions teach that when we harm others, we also harm ourselves. Let's focus on the victims of society's discrimination. Women, blacks, Jews, I've already mentioned. Think about the impact of discrimination against them. Think about the impact it had on their self-esteem. Women, blacks, Jews, conditioned to feel inferior. In fact, Sigmund Freud, a Jew, in his autobiography, says that when he attended the University of Vienna in the late 19th century, that since he was a Jew, he was expected to act as if he were an inferior human being. Freud, by the way, in his autobiography, says that he adamantly refused to do so. And in a historic book, a terrific book about the black experience in the southern part of the United States, John Howard Griffin, in a book called Black Like Me, written in the 1960s, talked about what it was like to be black in the southern part of the United States, talked about the daily humiliations that black people suffered. Interestingly enough, John Howard Griffin, the man who wrote this book entitled Black Like Me, was not black. He made himself black. He took certain kinds of pills, which in conjunction with ultraviolet light from a sun lamp, made his skin look dark enough to pass for a Negro. And he also shaved his head, so that in 1959, he went through certain areas of the South, appearing to be a bald-headed Negro. And about a year later, he stopped taking the pills, let his hair grow back, and went back to the same places as a white man. And again, in this book entitled Black Like Me, a book I highly recommend, he talked about the contrasting experiences of being the same person, going through the South as a black man and then as a white man. By the way, imagine your reaction if somebody tried to make your children feel inferior, as the slave system and the segregation system in the United States at one time attempted to do. American writer Paul Goodman, in his very famous book entitled Growing Up Absurd, says that white people in the South who resisted integration, who fought integration, who wanted black people separated from white people, in his book, Goodman says these people should not have been hauled into court, but rather sent to psychiatrists. We are dealing with the question, can society make people sick? And it's interesting that Mark Twain, in his very famous book, Huckleberry Finn, also addressed himself to this issue. Those of you who have read Huckleberry Finn might recall, in perhaps the most poignant moment in the book, Huckleberry, a young boy of about 12 years of age, who is helping a slave to escape. They're on the Mississippi River on a raft. Huckleberry decides that he really shouldn't help this slave to escape because he will go to hell for doing that. And his conscience is bothering him. And he decides at one time that he's going to turn Jim in, that he's not going to help him to escape. But then his conscience begins to bother him again, and he decides that he has no choice but to help Jim to escape, even though Huckleberry concludes he'll go to hell for helping someone to escape from slavery. Think about the impact of society's values on that young boy. Even though a fictional character, one can assume that it wasn't unusual that 12-year-old boys in the slaveholding South, white 12-year-old boys, believed that to help someone escape from slavery was sinful. Another important question, can society's definition of success cause people mental and emotional problems? Again, can society's definition of success cause people emotional and mental problems? The very famous psychiatrist Carl Jung addressed himself to this problem. Jung was a Swiss psychiatrist in the late 1800s, early 1900s. In fact, right up until about 1960, actually, he was practicing psychiatry. Jung said that most of his patients were very successful Swiss careerists. They were lawyers, they were doctors, they were prosperous businessmen. And what was the problem they were experiencing? Well, according to psychiatrist Carl Jung, many claimed of emptiness and depression, despite great success in their careers. Jung's diagnosis of many of these people was the following. He said many of them were not clinically depressed. What they were suffering from was having conformed too much. They were suffering from not having been true to themselves. And Jung's treatment was to encourage his patients to engage in what he called the process of individuation. In other words, the process of becoming individuals in contrast to the mass man or the mass woman. The idea was that one should cultivate what is idiosyncratic in oneself, and one should be happy about cultivating what might be eccentric in oneself, provided, of course, one is not hurting another human being. So Carl Jung raises an important question, and that is, what is success? What is success? I wonder how many people have thought deeply about this question. And I wonder if a person has only thought in a very shallow manner about the question. I wonder if that person may be suffering from his or her definition of success. By the way, in a later program, in my series of programs, I'll be addressing myself to what the great thinkers have claimed constitutes success. More recently, American psychoanalyst Douglas LeBeer also addressed himself to this question of what is success. He mentioned that he's treated many American successful careerists, and they, like Jung's patients, have experienced depression, nervousness, emptiness, etc. He talks about his patients, again, very successful careerists, experiencing headaches, stomach problems, insomnia, much anger, and he says they lead very stressful lives. And according to psychoanalyst LeBeer, why do many American successful careerists suffer emotional, mental problems? He says very often it's because of the compromises and trade-offs that they have participated in order to achieve success. He says that many of them feel they have betrayed themselves and their most noble values. And what is the treatment psychoanalyst LeBeer suggests for these successful careerists suffering from depression and nervous disorders? Well, his prescription sounds like something right out of the Bible or right out of Buddhism. He says these successful careerists must learn to experience the pleasures of developing the interior life. For example, moral courage, acting according to principles, loving other people, giving to others. And again, LeBeer also agrees that part of the problem is society's definition of success. It is interesting that so often, so many Americans define success in terms of money, status, and power, and not in terms of virtue, and not in terms of mental health. Some would conclude that perhaps the most successful people are the people who experience the most tranquility every day, regardless of how much money, status, or power they have. Some would say that Jesus also was a profound psychologist in this respect, in that Jesus talked about people gaining the world, but losing themselves. And Jesus emphasized the idea that Jesus emphasized the idea that ethics is the root of mental health. It's interesting that in the 20th century, famous psychiatrist Alfred Adler said something very similar. Psychiatrist Adler contended that being ethical is the foundation of mental health. Being ethical is the foundation of mental health. Indeed, Alfred Adler said that much of his psychology was based on biblical wisdom. Much of his psychology was based on biblical wisdom. Is it true that the path to better mental health involves the realization that society, every society, may be sick in some way or another? The Buddha said, "The world is in darkness. How few have the eyes to see." Freud said that since all people are sometimes irrational, it means that society is often going to be irrational. And T.S. Eliot, in a very famous play called The Cocktail Party, addresses himself to this question. One of his characters, a woman named Celia, goes to a psychiatrist, and she says this to the psychiatrist. She says, "Dr. Riley, I should hope that you find something wrong with me, because if you don't, it means there's something wrong with the world. It means there's something wrong with the world itself, and that's much more frightening. That would be terrible. So again, I hope you find something wrong with me, in contrast to there being something wrong with the world. If it's true that society can make people sick, what's the proper attitude towards society? Well, the great thinkers have said we should all be skeptical of society's values, even if we are living in a relatively healthy society, and that we should also engage in critical thinking. It's so important that schools cultivate in students an ability to think critically, to look at the advantages and disadvantages, for example, of a situation. It's also important that we take personal responsibility for our own actions, and that we take actions to improve our own mental health and that of others. And I think a very important question we must all ask ourselves if we wish to achieve better mental health is the following: how much should I conform? How much should I conform? You know, it's been the nonconformists who have done so much in history to improve society's mental health. Jesus, Buddha, St. Francis of Assisi, Lincoln, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, Tolstoy, Gandhi, all these people realized that society was sick in one way or another. And it took nonconformists like Buddha, like Jesus, like Lincoln, like Elizabeth Cady Stanton, to help improve the mental health of society. Famous American essayist Ralph Waldo Emerson, in his very famous essay entitled Self-Reliance, said this: "Society everywhere is in conspiracy against the manhood of every one of its members." He then went on to say, "Whoso would be a man must be a nonconformist." Emerson also said, "The centuries are conspirators against the sanity of the soul." The centuries are conspirators against the sanity of the soul. Finally, Emerson, in his essay entitled Self-Reliance, says that superior minds question society's customs. He says that society does not like to have its customs and traditions questioned. But he goes on to say this, and these are Emerson's own words: "But the interrogation of custom is an inevitable stage in the growth of every superior mind." Finally, Henry David Thoreau reminds us that we are all artists. In Walden, Thoreau wrote the following: "To affect the quality of the day, that is the highest of arts."